Hi guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I'm sorry that I'm out today. One of my kids has been undergoing a health problem, so I really apologize. It's made the year a little bit more challenging. But I did want to give you guys a little bit of an overview of that Schenck versus United States homework. So there is on Schoology under assignments a list of questions, and you can submit this to Schoology, and you can skip the first two questions, the things that relate to the modern day discussion that we had about colleges and Middlebury College and freedom of speech. Kind of we discussed that in like class a little bit. You can also, not worry so much about the first question. Really just focus on the questions that relate to the Schenck case, and just kind of handling some of the primary sources. So what I would suggest is to kind of turn off the video and do some of the reading of the sources first and actually answer the questions first. And then this video will maybe help you kind of review some of your answers and see if there's a couple of things, commentary wise or extension wise, I can add, and then you can submit the homework. Okay. In about maybe a week or so, we'll probably have a quiz on some of the World War I content, so this is stuff you'll be responsible for. And, just kind of in the big picture of things, the home front of World War I in the U.S. is very much defined by some of the activities of the government. And we know that there's a great deal of like government control over productivity in terms of arms, and some government control over things like kind of this effort to create propaganda so that people are more loyal. There's also, of course, this huge crackdown on dissent, and some of this maybe comes from the personality of Wilson, who as a president was a little bit more paranoid about dissent. He, didn't necessarily tweet against it, but he ultimately, created ways in which to kind of quiet dissent. And some of this also spoke to the desire to have Americans in a very, very like kind of lock and step during this wartime. So this, in terms of freedom of speech, is looked at as like a landmark time, right? We can kind of point back to the time period of early World War I and say, this is not what we would like to see America go back to, right? It's looked at as kind of a not quite a heyday of free speech, but a censorship time period. So one of the cases to look at is the Charles Schenck case, Schenck versus U.S., and this becomes a really significant landmark case, mostly because of the test that it sets up in terms of limitations against free speech, and especially free speech, that violated at this time the Espionage Act. Okay, so firstly, the Espionage Act becomes a really critical act of 1917. It is looked at as a way to squelch any type of activity that could subvert the war effort. This might, of course, include things like activity that might be an effort to stop the arms production. It might limit things like sabotage. So there are, in some cases, some spy activities and some efforts to try to do that sort of thing. And the Espionage Act might be kind of purposeful in that. But the Espionage Act also goes way further and basically suggests that, any American who speaks out against the war, against the Constitution, says something derogatory about the American democracy, does something where they prohibit people from signing up for the draft, or in some way incite people to protest the draft, if they do something where they're stopping the production of food goods or something that's necessary for the war effort, they could potentially be violating the Espionage Act, and the Espionage Act holds a penalty of up to 20 years. And quite a few of the 2,000 or so people who become guilty of violating this and get jailed end up becoming in jail for a significant amount of time. And the Espionage Act has a couple of like key sections to it, so do read over the USA Espionage Act. The section that you're looking at is dated 1918, and this is actually the Espionage Act at its like kind of most heightened form. It was given a little bit of extra teeth by something called the Sedition Amendment. Sometimes it's referred to separately as the Sedition Act. It's really one piece of legislation that was enhanced in 1918. So you see something like, for example, and I'm just quoting from the document, whenever the U.S. is at war, anyone who shall willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution, or the military, or the flag, or the uniform of the Army. Any language intended to bring the form of government, or the Constitution, or the military, or the flag into contempt, scorn, or disrepute. So there's kind of any language that could be derogatory against the government could potentially be perceived to be a violation of the Espionage Act. And so this has an effect of really affecting individuals who could potentially be labor activists who might strike against a factory. This also affects lots of people, including American socialists, who are perhaps going to dissent against the war. So anyone who wants to advocate for peace or hold an opinion about the U.S. government's role in the war becomes perhaps guilty of the Espionage Act. And Charles Schenck is one of these individuals. He creates a pamphlet. You can check out the video that's under Schoology, so you can see from the National Archives the pamphlet that Schenck created. He basically suggests that individuals should protest against the draft. He's anti the draft, think this is a problem for the government to do, speaks out about it, and creates about 15,000 pamphlets that get printed and published and sent out, and uses the mail in order to do this, uses the federal government's mail system, and ultimately this becomes what he gets charged for. So he's created the document, he's printed the document, he used the mail for the document, and there's a variety of charges in places that he violated the Espionage Act. So he actually does get charged with violating the Espionage Act, gets arrested, and ultimately would be serving 20 years. Charles Schenck will bring the case to the Supreme Court, suggesting that the Espionage Act is a violation of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, that his political speech and beliefs should not be affected by the Espionage Act, and ultimately they should be protected speech. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who is the gentleman on the right in the picture that you're looking at, was the Supreme Court justice that wrote the majority opinion, and this ends up being a case where there's a unanimous vote from the members of the Supreme Court, and they ultimately do not decide in favor of Schenck. They look at the context of the war and ultimately kind of pose the question, is political speech in a time period of U.S. at war, is that potentially more, does it have a higher standard, and is there risk of that political speech creating so much havoc that potentially there could be a reason to limit that speech? And so the name of the test that Oliver Wendell Holmes creates is known as the clear and present danger test, and he actually uses an infamous analogy. So look carefully through that second document to try to check out some of the argument made by Oliver Wendell Holmes. He does argue that the idea of, for example, someone saying something against the draft could be potentially like yelling falsely fire in a very, very crowded theater. And if you can imagine kind of what the outcome of yelling fire in a very crowded theater would be, there's kind of pandemonium and chaos. And Oliver Wendell Holmes makes a case that that is a clear and present danger if somebody incites that type of chaos when a country's at war. It could affect the military overseas. It could affect, the operations that the government has planned, and it could affect, the entire war effort. So if somebody's speech, political speech, is in a position to kind of violate the clear and present danger test, then ultimately Oliver Wendell Holmes makes a case that in a time of war, that type of speech can be banned. This becomes a case that ultimately does get very criticized. One of the folks who criticizes it is Zechariah Chafee, and this becomes a huge influence on Oliver Wendell Holmes. So look at the Zechariah Chafee argument. There's a case made against Oliver Wendell Holmes's decision and the clear and present danger test. And there's a couple key parts of the Chafee document that you might want to check out. There is a description of the argument. And, Chafee says clearly the problem of the limits of speech in wartime is no academic question. There's a whole wars are no, he cites Ludendorff, wars are no longer won by armies in the field, but by the morale of the whole people. The widespread Liberty Bond campaigns, shipyards, all of these things are felt to make the entire United States a theater of war. Attacks upon our cause are as dangerous as if made against the soldiers in rear trenches. So he kind of gives some credence to what Oliver Wendell Holmes was trying to do in the Schenck case. The government regards it as inconceivable that the Constitution should cripple its efforts to maintain public safety. Abstaining from countercharges of disloyalty and tyranny, let us recognize the issue as a conflict between two vital principles, an endeavor to find the basis of reconciliation between order and freedom. So he kind of sets the terms of what ultimately he is going to propose, right? And he says, reject two extreme views in the controversy, that, should it be that freedom of speech may be ignored in war, or is it that, any, type of speech, is free? So he kind of has like, okay, there's an absolute argument, free speech is always, the case, or it should be that, freedom of speech may be ignored in war. And so he says, okay, obviously we're going to go in between these two views, what is the correct? And, it's in line 31 on this document where he really starts to set up his particular version. The true meaning of freedom of speech seems to be this, okay? And one of the most important purposes of society and government is the discovery and spread of truth on subjects of general concern. And it's this idea of truth that he really focuses on. So I encourage you to look at how does Chafee kind of challenge Oliver Wendell Holmes in the sense of what is the best way in a society to come about the truth, right? How do we get to that place? And, look carefully at that. The Chafee argument is actually such an influence to Oliver Wendell Holmes that there's another case, Abrams versus U.S. in 1919. It's a very interesting case. Same time period, a little bit after the war is over, but the United States is actually fighting in Russia at a certain point in time to try to open up the Eastern Front again and essentially stop the Bolsheviks from ending Russia's role in the war. So the United States actually sends Americans to fight against the Bolshevik revolution. This incites some Russian Americans to actually become critical of the government. And in some cases, there are documents made that suggest some of the ways in which some of these individuals, and Abrams is one of them, he's actually a Russian Jew who had been in the United States and ultimately, disagrees with the United States role. And he creates a leaflet that is literally thrown from the fourth floor of a window and sent out. And Abrams also becomes guilty of the Espionage Act and ultimately served time of about 20 years. In this particular case, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and the court kind of looks at the clear and present danger case very similarly to Schenck and basically says this is the same thing. So ultimately, Abrams is kind of in a position that, the Espionage Act is fine and is kind of cleared by the courts. And that's actually the way that this case goes. So the majority ruling is basically this is a violation of the clear and present danger test. But interestingly, Oliver Wendell Holmes, in a very important dissent, along with Louis Brandeis, there is a claim that he suggests, and the quote is here, the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get accepted in the competition of the market, denying that a silly leaflet published by an unknown man constituted such a danger. So Oliver Wendell Holmes questions, in the Abrams case, this idea that one leaflet thrown or a couple of leaflets thrown from the fourth floor by somebody who was relatively insignificant is really going to create a situation that, the entire war effort that the United States was doing in Russia is going to be undermined. And the effect, is kind of maybe just way too big in a sense for the belief system. And if Oliver Wendell Holmes' dissent could be considered, he very much changes the clear and present danger doctrine to something that's a little bit more refined, and he starts to consider the intent, right? Is it the intent, was the intent there to really overthrow the entire operation, or was it just kind of expressing a belief of dissatisfaction with the way things were going? And then also kind of to see, was there a realistic way of looking at the outcome? And Oliver Wendell Holmes ends up dissenting. It doesn't change the outcome that the court goes with, which is the same way as Schenck. So this is a fairly rigorous time period in terms of prosecution against free speech. But in any case, Oliver